The cold came before the light. In February of 1962, the kind of winter that old men in Blackwater Valley would still be talking about 20 years later settled over the Wyoming plains like a held breath. The thermometer outside the feed store in town had stopped moving at 20 below zero. The creek that ran through the eastern pastures had frozen so solid that Virgil Harmon's ranch hands walked across it without thinking twice. On the third morning of that freeze, Virgil Harmon rode out before sunrise. He was 70 years old, broad across the shoulders, shaped by 4 decades of work that never stopped and weather that never apologized. He had built the largest cattle operation in Blackwater Valley through a combination of patience, calculation, and a particular talent for knowing what other people needed before they knew it themselves. That morning he rode east along the Ridge Road. He told himself he was checking fence line. He was not checking fence line. He pulled his horse to a stop at the crest of the ridge and looked down into the shallow depression where the land flattened before the creek bend. Down there, half buried in a drift that had sculpted itself against the curved metal walls, sat a Quonset hut. A military surplus steel shell, the kind the government had sold off cheap after the war, the kind that serious men in serious climates called a coffin waiting for a body. Virgil had been saying that for 9 months. He watched, and then he saw them. 2 columns of smoke, thin, steady, unhurried, rising straight up into the gray pre-dawn sky as though the cold had no argument with them whatsoever. Not one chimney. 2. He sat very still in the saddle. His horse shifted beneath him, breath-fogging in great white clouds. The smoke kept rising, calm, even, patient as the woman who had put it there. Something moved through Virgil Harmon's chest that he did not have a name for. It sat between anger and something older and less comfortable. He had been certain. He had been completely, absolutely certain. He turned his horse around and rode back the way he had come. He did not check the fence line. 9 months earlier, on a morning in late April, when the Wyoming sky was the particular shade of blue that makes a person believe in things, a battered Ford pickup truck came rattling down the dirt road into the valley. It came slowly the way things come when they are carrying something heavy and do not want to spill it. Behind the cab, tied down with rope and covered with a canvas tarp that flapped at the corners, lay 800 curved steel panels. A Quonset hut military surplus purchased for $220 from a government lot in Cheyenne. Beside the driver's window, if you had been standing close enough to see, you would have noticed that the side mirror had been cracked for some time and repaired with electrical tape. You would have noticed that the truck's running board on the passenger side was dented inward as though it had been stepped on by someone in a great hurry. You would have noticed the hands on the steering wheel. They were not young hands. They were 64 years old, those hands, and they showed it. Knuckled, weathered, the kind of hands that have wrung out laundry in cold water and kneaded dough before dawn and held the hands of people who were leaving and then let go because there was nothing else to do. Edna Whitfield gripped the steering wheel and looked at the land through the cracked windshield. She had driven 412 miles to get here. She had stopped twice. Once for gasoline, once because Blythe, her youngest grandchild, had needed to use the restroom, and there was no arguing with a 7-year-old on that particular subject. Beside her, pressed together on the bench seat like a row of mismatched books, sat her 3 grandchildren. Harriet was 15. She sat closest to the passenger window with a paperback open in her lap that she had not been reading for the last hour. She was the kind of girl who noticed everything and said less than half of what she noticed. Her jaw was set in a way that looked like her grandmother's jaw, though neither of them had ever been told this. Callum was 12. He sat in the middle and he had spent the last 50 miles counting telephone poles. He had a small notebook in his back pocket where he kept numbers, not because anyone asked him to, but because numbers were the one thing in his experience that did not change their meaning, depending on who was saying them. Blythe was 7. She had fallen asleep against Callum's shoulder somewhere in Nebraska and woken up in Wyoming and accepted this transition without complaint. She had her grandmother's old cardigan wrapped around her shoulders because the truck's heater ran warm on the driver's side and cold everywhere else. Edna stopped the truck. The land in front of her was grass and sky and a thin silver line of creek in the middle distance. There was nothing else. No house, no barn, no structure of any kind. Just the particular silence of open country in spring when the wind has not yet decided what it wants to do. "Where's the house?" Callum asked. Edna looked at the canvas-covered pile of steel behind them. "We're going to build it," she said, "together." The story of how Edna Whitfield came to be sitting in a battered truck on an empty piece of Wyoming land with 3 grandchildren and 800 steel panels is not a long story, but it is a heavy one. Her son Daniel had worked the copper mines in central Wyoming. He was 36 years old, careful by nature, the kind of man who double-checked his equipment and came home on time and called his mother every Sunday. In the autumn of 1960, a support timber gave way in a tunnel 60 feet underground. 3 men did not come back up. Daniel was one of them. His wife left 6 weeks after the funeral. There was no dramatic exit, no argument that the children could point to later. She was simply there one morning and gone the next, and the note she left was short enough that Edna could have memorized it without trying. Edna had a house in Kansas City. She had a savings account that represented 40 years of careful living. When she sat down and did the arithmetic, really did it, on paper the way her husband Clarence had always insisted, she understood that she could keep the Kansas City house and pay for 3 children for perhaps 2 years. Or she could sell the house, buy land somewhere that land was still cheap, and build something that could last. A proper timber house in Wyoming would cost $2,000. She had $900 left after the land purchase, the truck, the fuel, and the Quonset hut panels. $900, 3 children. Wyoming winter coming in 6 months. She was not reckless. She was not naive. She was a 64-year-old woman who had lived long enough to know that there is a difference between a bad option and no option, and that sometimes a bad option is the only kind of courage available. She bought the steel. Virgil Harmon came the first morning. He rode up while Edna was still unloading panels from the truck bed, Callum counting them as they came down, Harriet marking numbers in the notebook she had already designated for this purpose. Virgil was a large physical presence on horseback. 70 years old, white-haired, with the kind of face that has spent so much time outdoors that the sun and wind have simply given up trying to change it further. He owned 600 acres east of the creek, the biggest spread in the valley, and he carried the particular ease of a man who has not had to explain himself in a long time. He looked at the pile of steel. He looked at the woman beside it. "That thing is a coffin," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who believed he was doing someone a favor by telling them the truth before they found it out the hard way. "Steel freezes. You'll burn through your wood in 2 weeks and still wake up shivering." Edna set down the panel she was holding. She looked up at him without shading her eyes, though the morning sun was directly behind him. "What would you have me do?" she said. "Sell the land," Virgil said. "Move to town. There are families who take in children. The county has programs." The wind moved through the grass between them. "My grandchildren stay with me," Edna said quietly. "All 3 of them." Virgil looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at the 3 children, Harriet with her notebook, Callum with his careful Count Blythe sitting on a panel eating a cracker she had produced from somewhere, and something shifted slightly in his expression, though he did not let it become anything nameable. He tipped his hat. He rode away. He did not look back. Edna watched him go. Then she picked up the panel she had set down and handed one end to Harriet. "Counts at 31, Callum said without being asked. "Then let's get to 32, Edna said. What Edna did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Virgil Harmon had ridden out to meet her before she had finished unloading her truck because he had already been to see the county assessor's maps 3 weeks earlier. The thin silver line of creek that ran through the western edge of her land was not merely decorative. In the dry months of July and August, when the upper pastures went brown and cracked, and the larger creeks reduced themselves to memory, that small tributary was the only reliable water source within 2 miles. Virgil's cattle needed it. His operation depended on it in a way that did not show up during wet years, but became catastrophically apparent during dry ones. He had been watching that parcel of land for 4 years, waiting for the right moment, the right price, the right arrangement. And then a 64-year-old widow from Kansas City had bought it for cash and shown up with a pile of steel and 3 children. He had offered to buy it back on the first morning because he believed quite genuinely that she would fail. Not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. A woman her age alone with no construction experience. Wyoming winter, a metal building, the math did not work. He expected her to be gone by November. He planned to make a second offer then, when the need was greater and the price would be lower. He did not yet understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Construction began the morning after they arrived. Edna had never built anything larger than a chicken coop. She said this to no one because it was not information that would help anyone. What she had done was spend 3 evenings in the Kansas City Public Library reading everything available about Quonset hut assembly, and she had purchased the official assembly manual from the government surplus office for 35 cents. And she had read it 4 times on the drive from Kansas City, the pages folded and annotated in the margins in her small, careful handwriting. The foundation was railroad ties cheaper than concrete sturdy enough, available from the salvage yard in town for $12 a truckload. The floor was pine boards discounted slightly warped but level once she shimmed them properly. She built a pulley system from wagon wheels and rope to raise the curved steel ribs because the ribs were heavy, and she was 64 and she was not going to let either of those facts become an excuse. The first rib took 3 days. By the third rib, she had refined the pulley angle and it took 6 hours. By the 12th rib, it took 4. Harriet handed up bolts in the sequence Edna called for, having memorized the pattern by the second day. Callum kept the count, bolts used, panels placed, hours worked in the notebook that was already becoming dense with numbers. Blythe gathered every nail or bolt that fell to the ground and brought it back to the pile with the seriousness of someone performing a task of genuine importance, because to her it was. One evening when the shadow of the half-finished frame stretched long across the grass and the 4 of them sat eating sandwiches in the back of the truck, Callum looked up at the curved ribs against the darkening sky. "It looks like the skeleton of something," he said. "It does," Edna agreed. "Something big," Blythe said. "Something that's going to keep us warm," Harriet said, in a voice that was trying hard to sound like she believed it. Edna looked at the frame. The steel caught the last of the light and held it. "We're a team," she said, "and our team does not quit." By August, the hut stood complete, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, a silver half circle sitting in the Wyoming grass, improbable and solid, gleaming in the late summer sun, with a kind of indifference to what anyone thought of it. Neighbors came to look. Some drove out specifically. Some happened past on the road and slowed, then stopped, then sat in their trucks for a while before driving on. A few climbed down and walked around it, knocking on the steel with their knuckles, testing the weight of the thing with their palms. Most said nothing directly to Edna, but the looks they exchanged with each other carried meaning that did not require translation. Virgil Harmon rode past twice in August and once in September. He did not stop. Inside, Edna had laid out the space carefully. Beds at one end for the children, a kitchen area in the middle, her own sleeping space at the other end near the second door. A potbelly stove, a good one, second-hand but solid, positioned in the center of the space, exactly as every piece of advice she had received and every practical consideration suggested. She had cut a single hole in the roof for the chimney. She had done it precisely exactly centered, exactly as the manuals described. She believed she was ready for winter. She was not ready for winter. The cold arrived in November without ceremony. Not dramatically, not with a storm or a wind event that could be named and remembered. It simply came down from the north one night and settled the way cold in that part of the country settles, as though it had always meant to be there and was only now getting around to it. The first week was manageable. Near the stove, the air was warm enough to sit without a coat. The children ate dinner at the small table in the center of the room where the heat was adequate, and for those first days, there was something almost pleasant about the tightness of it, the way the 4 of them occupied the warm center of the hut, like a small, self-sufficient world. But the cold was not finished. By the second week, the difference between the center and the ends of the hut had become impossible to ignore. 15 feet from the stove, breath turned white. At the far ends where Edna slept, where the water buckets sat, where the boots were lined up near the second door, the temperature dropped in ways that a thermometer made embarrassingly clear. 20 degrees colder than the center. Then 25. Water in the bucket at the north end froze solid before midnight. The steel walls wept with condensation during the brief, warmest part of the afternoon, then froze. Long vertical streaks of ice formed on the interior walls, running from the ceiling to the floor, and at night they crept inward, and the sound of metal contracting in the deep cold was a sound the children would remember for the rest of their lives. Edna fed the fire every 2 hours. She set an alarm, a small wind-up clock she placed on the shelf above her cot, and she rose every 2 hours through the night to add wood to the stove. She did this not because it was sustainable, but because it was necessary, and she had made a practice in her life of doing necessary things without calculating whether she had the energy for them first. Harriet's cough began in the third week. It was not a serious cough, not a dangerous cough, just the kind of persistent, low cough that comes from sleeping in air that is too cold for too long. But it was a cough that Edna heard every time she woke to feed the fire, and it was a cough that she did not know how to stop. Blythe stopped singing. This was in its way the more alarming development. Blythe had hummed or sung almost continuously since she could form sounds in the truck during construction, while eating, while carrying stray nails back to the pile. The singing was so constant that its absence when it came was louder than the sound itself had been. It stopped on a Tuesday night in the third week of November, and Edna noticed it the next morning and felt the absence of it like a drop in pressure. She did not cry. Crying was a thing she allowed herself in private, and she had not yet allowed herself enough private time to do it. Instead, she sat down at the small table after the children were asleep, and she opened the notebook she had been keeping since October. Every day since they moved in, she had been recording numbers. Outside temperature recorded 3 times daily from the thermometer nailed to the exterior wall beside the door. Interior temperature at 5 points inside the hut. She had marked the locations with small pieces of tape and numbered them 1 through 5. Amount of wood consumed each day, measured in armloads, with a note about the starting condition of the stack. She had done this quietly without telling the children, not because it was secret, but because she did not want them to understand yet how seriously she was studying a problem she did not yet know how to solve. She spread the pages on the table now and looked at them. The numbers were not random. They were a pattern, and the pattern was telling her something specific. The temperature at points 1 and 5, the two ends of the hut, dropped faster than the center and recovered more slowly. The heat from the single central stove rose. It reached the curved ceiling, and then it had nowhere to go, and so it dissipated. The ceiling itself was the problem. The beautiful curved ceiling that made the building possible was the same surface that gathered the heat and held it too high beyond the reach of anyone trying to sleep or breathe or stay alive below it. She sat with this for a long time. The wind pressed against the steel walls from outside, and the walls groaned very slightly under the pressure, and the stove ticked as the metal heated and cooled in small rhythms. Edna looked at the notebook. She looked at the far ends of the hut, where she could not see in the dark. She looked up at the ceiling. The heat was up there. She could feel it, the subtle difference 3 feet above her head between air that had warmth in it and air that had given warmth up. The heat was not gone. It was trapped. It had risen to where it could not help anyone, and it was staying there, spreading sideways along the curve of the ceiling, moving toward the ends of the building, and then falling at the very edges, which was why the walls at the ends were always the coldest, why the water buckets froze, why Harriet coughed in the night. The heat was going to the wrong places. She picked up her pencil. She drew a long rectangle in the margin of the notebook page representing the interior of the hut from the side. She drew arrows, heat rising from the center, traveling up and out along the ceiling, falling at the ends. She drew it again, changed the arrows, added a second source at each end. She looked at what she had drawn for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and went to add wood to the stove because it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning and the alarm was about to go off anyway. And standing between a problem and its solution was a condition she had learned to be patient about. The solution would come. She would keep looking until it did. What she could not know, yet sitting in the cold center of her steel house at 2 in the morning, was that the solution had already presented itself in the number she had been writing down for weeks, and that the action required to implement it would look, to everyone watching from outside, like the act of a woman who had lost her mind. It would require a second hole in the roof. It would require climbing up there herself, and it would require doing it in the middle of a Wyoming winter, while the largest landowner in Blackwater Valley stood at the edge of the road and laughed. She would do all of this, but first she went to sleep for 2 hours because she was 64 years old, and she was not foolish, and rest was also a kind of preparation. Outside, the cold held everything in its grip, patient and indifferent, pressing against the steel walls of the little hut. Inside, the stove kept its small fire. And in the notebook on the table in Edna Whitfield's careful handwriting, the beginning of the answer waited in columns of numbers, patient as she was ready to be found by anyone willing to look long enough and hard enough and honestly enough at what the numbers were actually saying. She had been looking since October. She would not stop now. Old Silas came on a Thursday. Nobody sent for him. Nobody in Blackwater Valley ever sent for old Silas because nobody knew exactly where he was at any given moment. He moved through the county in a rusted International Harvester truck that carried his tools in the bed and his life in a wooden box behind the seat, stopping where stopping seemed useful and moving on when it did not. He was 72 years old and he had been fixing stoves and furnaces and boilers in rural Wyoming for longer than most of the people he fixed them for had been alive. He pulled off the road in front of Edna's hut on a Thursday morning in early March and sat in his truck for a moment, engine running, looking at the building. Then he climbed down, walked to the door, and knocked twice. Edna opened it. Old Silas looked past her into the interior of the hut. He did not ask permission. He stepped inside and stood in the center of the space and turned slowly the way a man turns when he is reading something written in a language most people cannot see. He looked at the stove. He looked at the ceiling. He walked to the north end of the hut and held his hand flat in the air at shoulder height and then at knee height. He walked to the south end and did the same thing. He came back to the center. "You're losing heat at both ends," he said. His voice was the texture of gravel that has been rained on for many years. "Cold air's pooling down there while the warm air sits up top doing nobody any good." Seen it before. Edna said nothing. She was watching him the way she watched things when she was learning from them. "One man fixed the same problem in a building like this," old Silas said. "Two stoves, one at each end." "Everyone says that would mean burning twice the wood," Edna said. Old Silas looked at her for a moment. There was no impatience in it, but no excess warmth either. Just an honest assessment of whether she was worth explaining things to. "Wrong," he said. "Two small fires burning steady use less wood than one big fire burning desperate. Smaller fires don't overheat the center. They push warm air toward the middle from both sides. Meats at the P has nowhere to go but down. You get circulation instead of stratification." He pulled on his gloves and walked to the door. "Two stoves," he said, "one at each end, second chimney through the roof." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away, and Edna stood in the doorway watching the truck until it disappeared around the bend in the road. And then she stood there a moment longer, not looking at anything in particular, just letting the idea settle into its proper place alongside everything she had already figured out on her own. She went inside and opened her notebook. She had already drawn the arrows. She had already mapped the failure. Old Silas had not given her the answer. He had confirmed the answer she had already worked out in the margins of her notebook at 2 in the morning in the cold, listening to Harriet cough. She picked up her pencil and wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. "Second stove." It was Cormac Delby who told her about Virgil Harmon's barn. Cormac was 65, the valley's metalworker, a man of few words and precise measurements, who had come out twice in the spring to look at Edna's roof seams and make sure they were watertight. He said things like, "That'll hold," and "that won't hold," and he was right both times without explaining how he knew. Edna had paid him in cash, and he had nodded and left, and she had the impression that he respected her the way one careful person respects another, without needing to make a conversation out of it. He stopped by one afternoon in late March, ostensibly to check the east seam, where a small gap had appeared in the winter. And while he was working, Edna mentioned she was planning to install a second stove. Cormac tightened a bolt and said without looking up, "Virgil's been running 2 stoves in his cattle barn since '57. Edna was quiet for a moment. "His cattle barn," she said. "South end and north end, works well. His cattle made it through the last 3 winters without losses from cold." Cormac set down his wrench. "Told me about it himself. Said it was the best modification he had ever made to that building." He looked up, then meeting her eyes briefly and then looking away. "Thought you might like to know." He packed his tools and left. Edna stood in the middle of the hut for a long time after he was gone. She thought about the morning in May when Virgil had ridden up on his horse and told her the steel building was a coffin. She thought about his voice, which had carried the particular confidence of a man sharing facts rather than opinions. She thought about every cold morning since November, every 2-hour alarm, every night she had listened to Harriet cough and watched Blythe's singing disappear like heat through an inadequate ceiling. She opened her notebook. She wrote down what Cormac had said, including the year. 1957, 5 years before she had arrived, 5 winters during which Virgil Harmon had ridden past her building, watched her struggle with a single stove and said nothing. She did not say anything about this to Harriet or Callum or Blythe, but she wrote it down. She wrote down everything because she had learned in the long course of her life that the things you write down cannot be taken from you the way the things you only remember can be. She closed the notebook and went to find out where she could buy a second stove. The stove cost $15. It came from the salvage yard in town, a cast-iron potbelly with a crack running 4 inches up the left side that the yard owner had repaired with furnace cement and declared functional, which it was, though it would never be pretty. Edna loaded it into the truck bed herself, declining the yard owner's offer of help with a politeness that left no room for argument. She drove home. She unloaded it herself. She spent 2 evenings reading everything she had about heat transfer and chimney draft in the assembly manuals, and in a dog-eared book about homesteading she had bought at a used bookstore in Cheyenne. She measured the hut carefully and determined where the second stove needed to go and at what angle the chimney needed to exit the roof to draw properly. Then she climbed up there. The roof of a Quonset hut is not flat. It is curved, which means that standing on it requires a different kind of balance than standing on flat ground. The kind of balance that does not come from strength, but from paying attention to where your weight is at every moment. Edna had attached a rope to the roof ridge from the inside and threaded it out through the front vent, and she used this rope as a guide not to hold herself up, but to know where she was in relation to the center. She was 64 years old. She was on the roof in March in Wyoming. She had to drill a metal cutting blade, and the measurements she had made the night before written on a piece of cardboard tucked into her coat pocket. Virgil Harmon drove past on the road. He stopped. He sat in his truck for a moment watching. Then he rolled down the window. "You've lost your mind," he called out. Edna was on her hands and knees on the curved roof measuring. She did not look up. "Maybe," she said, "the way you say something that is not an argument, but is not an agreement either." She found the mark she had made with chalk. She picked up the drill. "You'll be burning twice the wood for half the heat," Virgil said. She began to cut. The metal screamed under the blade in the particular way cold metal screams, high and sharp, carrying across the flat valley air in every direction. Virgil sat in his truck. He watched her work for another minute. Then he rolled up his window and drove on, and Edna kept cutting, careful and deliberate, following the chalk line exactly. When she came down, Callum was waiting beside the truck. "The hole looks right," he said, studying his notebook. "Diameter matches the stovepipe." "I know," Edna said. "I measured it from inside," he said. "The center point is 11 inches from where you said it would be." "I know," she said again. Callum looked at his notebook, then at the roof. "You measured right," he said with the particular satisfaction of a 12-year-old whose numbers have been confirmed by physical reality. Edna put her hand briefly on top of his head, the way she had done since he was small, and went inside to install the stovepipe. That night, she lit both stoves. She did not make an event of it. She did not gather the children to watch or explain what she hoped would happen. She simply built 2 small fires. Not large fires, not the kind of roaring blaze she had maintained all winter in the single central stove, but small, measured-even fires, one at the north end of the hut and one at the south. And then she sat down in a chair in the exact center of the space, and she waited. Harriet was reading near the north stove. Callum was at the table with his notebook. Blythe was on her cot, already in her pajamas, doing something with a collection of small stones she had been arranging and rearranging for 3 days. For the first 20 minutes, nothing seemed different. Then Edna held up her hand, palm flat at shoulder height. The air that touched her palm was not the same air that had been there before. It was moving, very slightly, barely perceptibly, but moving a slow circulation, warm from the north end traveling toward the center at ceiling height. Warm from the south end, doing the same, the 2 currents meeting above her head, and having for the first time nowhere to go, but down. Down along the curved walls, down across the floor, down to where the people were. She stood up and walked to the north end of the hut. She held her hand at knee height. Warm. She walked to the south end. Warm. She went to the wall where ice had formed every night since November, and she pressed her palm flat against the steel. Not warm, but not the shocking cold that had been there all winter. Something in between. Something workable. She looked at the thermometer she had mounted to the interior wall at the midpoint. 61 degrees. She walked to the thermometer she had mounted at the north end behind Harriet's chair. 60 degrees. The one at the south end. 61. She stood in the middle of the hut and looked at the two stoves burning at their small, steady pace, one at each end, and the curved ceiling above them, that was doing now exactly what she had drawn in the margins of her notebook, collecting the warmth, channeling it, sending it back down to the people below, instead of keeping it for the cold air above. She sat down on the floor. The floor was warm, not like a heated floor in a fine house, but warm, the way ground is warm in early summer, a gentle, constant warmth rising through the pine boards, the warmth that happens when the air circulating above them has been doing its work long enough to give some back. Edna Whitfield sat on the warm floor of her steel house on a March night in Wyoming, and she wept, not loudly, not dramatically, the way a person weeps when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally found a place where it is safe to put it down. Her shoulders moved. Her hands came up to her face. The sound she made was small and private, and it lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Harriet looked up from her book. She looked at her grandmother sitting on the floor. She put the book down. She walked across the hut and sat down on the floor beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not say anything because she understood with the particular clarity of a 15-year-old who has lost her father and watched her grandmother carry everything since that there was nothing to say, and that presence was what was needed. They sat on the warm floor together. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the plains. It pressed against the steel walls and found, as it had found all winter, the places where the cold could enter. But the cold entered now into air that was moving, circulating, refoulement, with the slow conversation of two small fires talking to each other across the length of the hut, passing warmth back and forth between them. And the cold that came in at the edges was absorbed into that conversation before it could settle. Blythe from her cot began to hum. It was soft. It was the beginning of a song she had been humming since she was 4 years old, something she had learned from her father, a simple repeating melody that meant nothing in particular and everything in general. She hummed it the way she always hummed it without thinking about it, because the urge to make sound had simply returned. Edna heard it through her hands. She lowered her hands from her face. She listened. She looked up at the curved ceiling, and the ceiling looked back the way ceilings do, indifferently, completely holding everything it was given. "The stoves are talking to each other," Callum said from the table. He had been watching the whole time, notebook open, pencil in hand, recording temperatures at 5-minute intervals, as though he had decided independently that this data was worth keeping. "Yes," Edna said, "they are, like passing something back and forth." "Like that," she said. She stood up. She went to her notebook and she wrote the time and the temperatures and the wood consumption for the evening, and then she wrote a sentence that was not a number, which was unusual for those pages. "It works. Both ends. 61 degrees throughout. Half the wood." She underlined the last 3 words. The letter came on a Wednesday in April. It was in a plain envelope from the county administrative office, which was the kind of envelope that does not contain good news. Edna opened it at the kitchen table while the children were at their lessons. She read it twice. Then she put it down and looked at the wall for a moment. An inspection had been requested by a concerned party. Conditions of habitation would be reviewed to determine suitability for minor children. The inspection would take place on April 22nd. Representatives from the County Bank Administration, the County Sheriff's Office, and the Wyoming State Office of Child Welfare would be present. She folded the letter and placed it in the back of her notebook. She thought about Callum's observation 2 weeks earlier that he had seen Virgil Harmon's truck parked outside the county administrative building for over an hour on a Tuesday morning. Callum had mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, as information, neutrally delivered without interpretation, leaving the interpretation to whoever needed it. Edna had written it down. She opened the notebook now and looked at what she had written. She looked at 4 months of temperature records and wood consumption logs and the small diagrams she had drawn in the margins. She looked at the sentence she had underlined. Half the wood. She closed the notebook and began to clean. Not the ordinary cleaning of daily life, but the particular systematic cleaning of someone who is preparing to be examined by people who are looking for reasons to find fault. She scrubbed the steel walls. She organized the food stores and counted them and recorded the count. She checked the water supply and the medical kit and the spare blankets. She cleaned the stovepipes and inspected the chimney collars and wiped down every surface in the hut until the steel sheeted back the light from the windows like hammered silver. She laid out the children's best clothes the night before. She placed the notebook on the table open to the first page of temperature records. On the morning of April 22nd, 3 vehicles came down the dirt road and parked outside the hut. Edna watched them through the window. She had her coffee cup in both hands, and she was holding it steady. The bank manager was a man named Aldrich, 40 years old, the kind of man who wore his suit jacket even outdoors in Wyoming because it was part of the equipment of his authority. The county sheriff was Pruitt, 55, who Edna had met once at the feed store and who had struck her as a person who did his job without adding to it. And the third person was a woman. Her name was Winifred Morse. She was from the Wyoming State Office of Child Welfare. She was perhaps 50 years old, iron-haired, wearing a coat that had seen many winters and boots that had walked through many difficult situations. She carried a clipboard, and she did not smile when she shook Edna's hand, not because she was unfriendly, but because she was working and smiling was not part of the work. She stepped inside and began. She moved through the hut methodically the way Edna had moved through problems, not rushing, not performing, simply looking at what was actually there. She checked the food stores and made notes. She looked at the sleeping areas and made notes. She tested the water and examined the medical supplies. She asked Harriet how she slept, and she asked Callum about his schoolwork, and she crouched down to Blythe's level and spoke to her for 3 minutes about something that made Blythe nod seriously before pointing to her collection of stones and beginning an explanation that Winifred listened to completely. Then she stopped between the 2 stoves. She stood there and felt the air. She looked at the stove at the south end and then turned and looked at the stove at the north end. She held her clipboard against her chest. "Why 2?" she said. "1 wasn't enough," Edna said. "The heat was rising to the ceiling and dying there. It wasn't reaching the ends of the building where the children sleep. I installed the second stove in March. The temperature is now consistent throughout." Consistent. Within 1 degree end to end. Winifred looked at her. "You measured this?" "Every day since October." Edna lifted the notebook from the table and held it out. Winifred took it. She stood where she was and began to read. She turned pages. She did not make notes. She simply read, moving through the columns of temperatures and the diagrams in the margins and the small careful notations that Edna had made every morning and every evening for 6 months. The bank manager, Aldrich, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at nothing in particular. Winifred turned the last page. She stood for a moment with the notebook open in her hands. Then she closed it and looked up. "This home is clean," she said. "It is warm. The children are healthy and adequately provided for." She handed the notebook back to Edna. "I see no basis for intervention." Aldrich took a step forward. "With respect, the structural conditions of a metal building in a Wyoming winter are documented in detail in this record." Winifred turned to look at him in a way that was not aggressive but was entirely complete. "The building maintains 61 degrees throughout. The children have adequate food, water, clothing, and a caregiver who has maintained written records of living conditions for 6 months. She looked at her clipboard and then back at him. "I evaluate facts, Mr. Aldrich, not concerns." The inspection was over. Edna walked the 3 of them to their vehicles. Aldrich did not look at her as he got in his car. The sheriff tipped his hat. Winifred Morse paused at her vehicle door and turned back. "That notebook," she said. "Keep it." "I intend to," Edna said. Winifred got in her car and drove away, and Edna stood in the dirt road and watched the 3 vehicles go, and then stood a moment longer in the empty air before going back inside. She sat down at the table. She put both hands flat on the surface. She breathed. Blythe climbed into her lap without being invited, which was her custom, and pressed her head against Edna's shoulder, and Edna put her arms around her and held her in the particular way of someone who has just been reminded of exactly what they are holding on for. "Did we pass?" Callum asked. "We passed," Edna said. He wrote it down. She had taught him to write things down, and he had taken the lesson seriously. The cold came back in a way nobody in Blackwater Valley was prepared for. February had been hard. The previous winters had been hard. But what settled over the valley in the second week of the month was something that the old men, the ones who measured winters against each other, the way other people measure years, would afterwards say was the worst in 30 years. -22 degrees. 5 days. The radio in town broadcast the warning 24 hours before it arrived, and families across the valley made their preparations. They brought in extra wood. They crowded into single rooms. They stuffed rags into gaps around window frames and doors. They did what people do when the cold comes at a level that is not merely uncomfortable, but potentially fatal. They reduced, simplified, concentrated everything they had into the smallest survivable space. At the Harmon Ranch, 600 acres of the most productive cattle land in Blackwater Valley, wood burned in every fireplace from the first day. Virgil's ranch hands worked in shifts feeding fires, breaking ice in the water troughs, moving cattle into the covered yards. Opal Harmon, Virgil's wife, had been fighting a winter cold since January, and on the second day of the freeze, her temperature climbed to a height that made Virgil stop what he was doing and stand very still in the kitchen doorway calculating. The main stove in this house was the old stone fireplace in the central room, a massive thing that Virgil's father had built in 1908, and that had never failed. On the third day of the freeze, it failed, not catastrophically, not in a way that announced itself. The draw simply died, a blockage somewhere in the chimney from the ice that had built up over weeks, and the fire that had been burning adequately for 60 years began for the first time to smoke back into the room instead of drawing up and out. The house filled with smoke in 2 hours. They opened the windows to clear it, which let in air that was 22 degrees below zero. By the time Virgil got the blockage cleared and the draw restored, the temperature inside the main room had dropped to levels that were not safe for a woman with a fever of 103. He moved Opal to the bedroom with the smaller stove. He banked that fire as high as it would go. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe. On the fourth morning, he went downstairs and looked at the wood pile. He was a man who had never miscalculated his wood supply in 40 years. He had miscalculated it now because the demand had been 3 times what any reasonable winter required, and what remained in the shed was not enough for 2 more days at this rate. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He was 70 years old, and he had spent the last 9 months being certain that Edna Whitfield would not make it through the winter. He had been certain with the confidence of a man who understood cold and building materials and the arithmetic of survival in a Wyoming climate. He had watched her build her ridiculous steel structure with something between contempt and reluctant curiosity. He had reported her living conditions to the county not out of genuine concern for those children, and the dishonesty of his own motivation had been a thing he had not examined closely. He stood up. He put on his coat. He put on his hat. He walked out to the truck, and he drove down the road in the gray pre-dawn light of a morning that was cold beyond what cold should be allowed to be, and he turned onto the dirt track that led to the Whitfield property. He stopped the truck. He sat for a moment. The 2 columns of smoke rose from the hut's roof into the black sky. Steady, unhurried. The same 2 columns he had seen from the ridge road 9 months ago at the beginning of all of this, which now felt like a different kind of time. He got out of the truck and walked to the door. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as though she had been awake for hours, which she had been. Edna Whitfield stood in the doorway in her housecoat and heavy socks, and she looked at Virgil Harmon, standing on her step in the pre-dawn dark of a morning that was 22 below zero. And she looked at his face, which was a face that had been stripped of everything it usually carried, all the authority and certainty and the particular ease of a man who has never needed to ask for anything. He said, "Opal's sick. The wood is running low. I don't know where else to go." His voice delivering those words was the voice of an old man in a cold morning who has run out of every other option. It was not a comfortable voice to hear, but it was an honest one, possibly the most honest thing he had said in 9 months, and Edna recognized honesty the way she recognized everything, by looking at it directly and writing down what she saw. She looked at him for a moment. 1 second. 2. Long enough that he felt it, but not long enough to be cruel. Then she opened the door wider. "Bring her in," she said. "The floor's warm." She stepped back and he stepped forward, and the cold outside pressed at the opening for a moment before the door closed again. And inside, the 2 stoves kept their small, steady conversation going, passing warmth back and forth across the length of the hut, the same warmth they had been making since March, patient and unhurried, doing what they had been built to do. Opal Harmon weighed less than Edna expected. That was the first thing she noticed when Virgil helped his wife through the door. Not the fever in her face or the shallow way she was breathing, but how small she had become inside her coat, the way illness reduces a person before anyone is ready to see it. Opal was 67 years old, and she had the bones of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, and she came through the door of the steel hut, leaning on her husband's arm, with the particular dignity of someone who is embarrassed to need help and has decided to accept it anyway. Edna took her other arm without asking. They moved her to the bed. Edna's own bed, the one at the south end of the hut near the stove where the circulation was warmest, and the drafts from the door would not reach. Edna pulled back the covers and helped Opal sit and then lie down, and she put her hand on Opal's forehead the way women of her generation had been putting hands on foreheads since before thermometers were common, reading temperature through the palm, the way a careful person reads weather through the skin. High, but not dangerous yet. The kind of fever that needs watching, not the kind that needs panicking over. How long has she had it? Edna asked. The cold started in January, Virgil said. He was standing at the foot of the bed with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. The fever since yesterday morning. Has she eaten? Not much, some broth yesterday. Edna went to the kitchen area and put water on to heat. She moved with the efficiency of someone who is not performing competence, but simply has it reaching for things where she knew they were measuring without hesitation, doing several things in the right order without needing to think about the order. Callum appeared beside her. He was 12 and he understood without being told that this was a moment for usefulness rather than questions. He took over the water heating without being asked, and Edna nodded at him and went back to Opal. Harriet had already brought extra blankets from the storage shelf. She was tucking them around Opal's feet with the methodical care of someone who has watched her grandmother do things carefully and absorb the methodology without realizing it. Opal looked up at her with the slightly unfocused gaze of the feverish. "You're a good girl," Opal said. "Sleep," Harriet said gently. "You can say nice things later." Blythe came and stood at the side of the bed and looked at Opal with the direct, assessing gaze that 7-year-olds bring to situations adults find complex. Then she reached out and took Opal's hand in both of her and held it, not saying anything, simply holding it with the complete sincerity that was Blythe's particular gift. Opal closed her eyes. Virgil watched all of this from the foot of the bed. He watched Edna move between the stove and the bedside with broth and cool cloths. He watched the 3 children organize themselves around the sick woman with a quiet competence that had clearly been taught by someone who knew how things needed to be done. He stood with his hat in his hands, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he understood this finally completely. He sat down in the chair in the corner. The chair was near the north stove. The warmth coming off it was steady and even, not the aggressive heat of an overworked fire, but the patient warmth of a fire burning at its proper pace. He had never sat in this chair before. He had never been inside this building before. He sat in the warm chair in the corner of the steel hut he had called a coffin, and he watched the woman he had tried to drive away take care of his wife. The 5 days of the freeze passed the way extreme cold always passes, slowly at the time, and then suddenly over the temperature lifting in a single afternoon, as though the cold had simply finished with what it came to do and moved on. On the second day, Opal's fever broke. She slept for 14 hours and woke up asking for eggs, which Edna provided. And the asking was a good sign, the kind of specific appetite that means the body has turned a corner and knows what it needs to rebuild itself. On the third day, Opal sat up and had soup and talked to Blythe for an hour about the stones Blythe had been collecting, and the conversation was serious and detailed on both sides, the way conversations between old women and young children sometimes become when neither party is performing anything for anyone else. On the fourth day, Virgil and Edna sat beside the north stove while Opal slept and the children were occupied at the table with their lessons. The fire between them burned at its measured pace. Outside, the cold was beginning its retreat, the temperature climbing from -22 towards something that still required a heavy coat, but no longer required fear. Virgil turned his hat in his hands. He had been turning it at intervals for 4 days, and the brim showed it. "The letter to the county," he said, "and the inspection." Edna looked at the fire. "It was me," he said. "I want you to know that I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The fire ticked. The metal of the stove expanded slightly in the heat, the small sound it made every few minutes that Edna had stopped noticing months ago. "I know," she said. "The creek," he said. "The water rights. I wanted the land, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought you'd be gone by November. I thought the winter would do what I didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. That is not something I am proud of. Edna was quiet too. Not the quiet of someone building toward a response, but the quiet of someone who is allowing a thing to be fully said before deciding what to do with it. Thomas was a good man, Virgil said. He meant her son. He worked hard. He was decent. He didn't deserve what happened to him, and you didn't deserve what I did. He set the hat on his knee. I'm telling you this because you deserve to hear it said plainly. I'm not asking for anything in return. Edna looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she looked at Virgil Harmon, who was 70 years old and sitting in a chair in the hut he had called a coffin, with the particular expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to be, and is not sure yet whether it is better or worse than where he started. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said. He nodded. He had not expected forgiveness, and he did not think he deserved it. But we can be neighbors, she said. Real ones. The kind that don't scheme against each other. The kind that help when help is needed. She looked at Opal sleeping at the far end of the hut. The kind we've been this week, whether we plan to be or not. I can do that, Virgil said. Then that's where we start. She stood up and went to check on Opal, and Virgil sat in the warm chair and looked at the fire, and somewhere in the looking, he arrived at something he could not have named precisely, but that felt in its unfamiliar way like the beginning of being a better man than he had been the previous 9 months. They shook hands when Opal was well enough to travel home. It was not a warm handshake. It was the handshake of two people who have made an agreement they intend to honor, which is a different thing from warmth, but not necessarily a lesser one. Cormac Delby came back in April with a notebook of his own. He had been watching all winter in the way that careful, precise men watch things from a distance without announcing themselves, taking measurements that other people don't think to take. He had driven past the Whitfield property 17 times between November and March, he told Edna later, and each time he had noted the 2 chimney columns and their behavior in different temperatures and wind conditions. He had drawn diagrams. He had done calculations. He had pages of numbers that told a story he wanted to tell properly. He sat at Edna's table and spread 12 pages of technical drawings across the surface. The drawings showed the interior of a Quonset hut from 3 angles, side, top, and cross-section, with arrows indicating air movement annotations, marking temperatures at various points, specifications for chimney height and stove placement, and the dimensions of the flat stones Edna had placed beneath each stove to hold heat through the night. He had written her name at the top of the first page. Edna looked at the drawings for a long time. They were precise and clear, and they said in the language of measurement and diagram exactly what she had been doing and why it worked. Take your name off, she said. No, Cormac said. I'm not an engineer. I didn't calculate any of this. You didn't have to calculate it, he said. You found it. That's different from calculating, and it's not less. He tapped the first page. Anyone can calculate what someone has already found. Finding it is the thing. Edna looked at her name at the top of the page. People need to know it's possible, Cormac said. They need to know a person did this, not a textbook. If it just says 2-stove convection system, they'll think it's complicated. If it says Edna Whitfield figured it out in a steel hut in Wyoming, they'll know they can do it themselves. He gathered the pages and squared them into a neat stack. I'm sending copies to the Agricultural Extension Office in Cheyenne, he said, and the Homesteaders Bureau, and anyone else who will read it. Edna put her hand flat on the table, looked at the stack of pages. Then keep my name on it, she said, but make sure it says it took me the whole first winter to get it right. Cormac allowed himself a small expression that was not quite a smile but was related to one. Already in there, he said, page 4. He left the copies with her and drove away, and the pages went into the drawer beneath the table where Edna kept things that needed to be kept next to the deed to the land and the photograph of her son that she looked at every evening before bed. Spring came to Blackwater Valley the way Wyoming spring always comes, reluctantly in stages, apologizing for itself with cold snaps that lasted 3 days and then receding again until eventually the grass came back and the creek ran high with snowmelt and the sky turned the particular blue that made a person feel that something was possible that hadn't been possible the day before. People started coming to the hut in April. Not all at once. One at a time, then 2, then in small groups of 2 and 3, driving or walking down the dirt road to the Whitfield property with the same question delivered in different ways. A couple from the north end of the valley who had lost half their woodpile in the freeze and spent 3 nights crowded into their kitchen. A widow from 5 miles east named Lavinia Scruggs, who had a Quonset hut of her own that she had been managing badly since her husband passed. A rancher named Del Purcell, who had 3 hired hands living in a converted steel outbuilding and had been listening to them complain about the cold since October. Edna showed them. She showed them the 2 stoves and where they needed to be placed and how far apart. She showed them the chimney angles and the draft requirements. She explained the stones beneath the stove's flat granite, at least 2 inches thick, which held heat for 4 hours after the fire died down and released it slowly through the coldest part of the night. She drew diagrams on whatever paper was available, and she drew them simply without technical language, in the way that she had worked out the problem herself through observation and common sense, and the willingness to look directly at what was actually happening rather than what she assumed was happening. She charged no one. Lavinia Scruggs pressed $2 into her hand at the end of a long explanation session, and Edna pressed it back. "Put it toward your second stove," she said. "I already budgeted for the stove," Lavinia said. She was 71 and had grown up in the Depression, and she understood that accepting help gracefully was its own form of respect for the person offering it. "Take the $2. Edna looked at her. "Half of it," she said. "$1." Lavinia kept the other dollar in her palm for a moment and then put it back in her coat pocket with the satisfaction of a woman who has negotiated successfully. Harriet helped with the explanations, translating Edna's practical language into the more detailed technical terms that some people needed. Callum made clean copies of the diagrams, his drafting neat and consistent, the measurements precise. Blythe made tea for everyone who came through the door, carrying mugs with the serious focus of someone performing a vital function, which she was. By the end of April, 4 Quonset huts in Blackwater Valley had second stoves installed. By the end of May, 6 more. Cormac's technical drawings had reached the Agricultural Extension Office in Cheyenne, and from there to the Homesteaders Bureau, and from there to farm supply stores that pinned them to bulletin boards alongside seed catalogs and equipment advertisements. Men who had laughed in May of 1961 drove out to buy second stoves in May of 1962. They did not generally acknowledge the connection. They said things like, "Heard there was a better way to heat these steel buildings," and saw a diagram somewhere. And Edna listened to them say these things, and she did not point out where the diagram had come from or whose name was at the top of the first page. She just showed them what they needed to know and sent them home with a hand-drawn copy of the stove placement guide and the specific dimensions for the granite heat stones. The valley was warming itself. That was the thing that mattered. Winifred Morse came back in late May. She drove up in the same vehicle she had arrived in during the April inspection, parked in the same place, and walked to the door with the same clipboard. But when Edna opened the door, Winifred Morse was not carrying the clipboard in a working position. She was carrying it tucked under her arm, the way a person carries something they brought out of habit rather than need. "I'm not here for an inspection," she said. "Come in," Edna said. Winifred came in and stood in the middle of the hut and looked around with the attentiveness she had shown the first time, but different now. Not the attentiveness of someone looking for problems, but the attentiveness of someone looking at something they want to understand fully. The 2 stoves sat at their respective ends of the hut. The stones beneath them were dark with months of heat absorption. The interior walls, which had wept with ice in November and December, were dry. The temperature in the hut was, on this mild May morning, a comfortable 64 degrees with no fire burning. Add all the residual warmth of the stones and the insulating effect of the setup Edna had built holding the spring air at a livable temperature without any active heating required. Winifred stood between the 2 stoves for a moment, feeling the air. She reached into her coat and produced an envelope. "This came to my office 2 weeks ago," she said, "from the Wyoming State Office of Housing Development." She held it out. "I forwarded your name to them in March, after the inspection." She paused. "I want you to know I would have done it regardless of the outcome of the inspection. What you built here needed to be seen by people who could do something with it." Edna took the envelope. She opened it. She read it. The letter was from a senior officer at the Wyoming State Office of Housing Development. The office was in the process of planning a series of low-cost housing units for rural communities across the state, prefabricated steel structures, quick to erect, affordable. They had encountered the problem that every person who had ever lived in such a structure encountered: the heating. They had reviewed Cormac Delby's technical drawings, which had arrived through the Agricultural Extension Office, and they had noted the name at the top of the first page. They would like to discuss the system in detail, the letter said. They believed it could be adapted for broader application across the state's housing program. They would be grateful for the opportunity to learn from the original source. Edna read the letter twice. She stood at her kitchen table with the letter in both hands, and she read it the way she read everything, completely without rushing, making sure she understood not just what it said, but what it meant. She looked up at Winifred. "I just wanted my grandchildren warm," she said. "I know," Winifred said, "but you found something in the process of wanting that." She looked around the hut one more time. Things that are found by necessity have a way of being more useful than things designed in offices. The office people know this, which is why they're writing to you instead of the other way around. She left the way she had come, efficiently, without ceremony, getting back into her vehicle and driving away up the dirt road as though she had simply delivered what needed delivering and had other things to attend to, which she did. Edna stood in the doorway and watched the vehicle go. She stood there after it was out of sight, looking at the road and the valley beyond it, and the mountains in the far distance that had snow on them, still even in May, the way Wyoming mountains always do. The creek ran through its bend in the middle distance, silver in the morning light. The same creek that Virgil Harmon had wanted badly enough to file a false complaint about. The same creek that ran through land that was hers, that had been hers from the moment she paid for it, that would continue to be hers for as long as she kept the terms of the homestead agreement. 5 years of continuous residence. She had been here 1 year. She had 4 more to go. She went inside and put the letter in the drawer beneath the table next to the deed and her son's photograph and the notebook that had started all of this, with 5 temperature readings a day and the belief that numbers, if you kept enough of them, would eventually tell you the truth. The years pass the way years pass when you are doing necessary things. The second winter was cold but not cruel. The third was the mildest anyone could remember. The fourth brought a late freeze in April that damaged the valley's early planting but did not touch the people inside their homes, because by then there were more homes in Blackwater Valley with 2 chimneys than without. And the valley had learned what Edna had learned, that warmth properly arranged will take care of itself if you give it the right conditions. Virgil Harmon kept his word. He kept it the way an old man keeps a word he has given to himself as much as to the other person, imperfectly at first, with the occasional lapse into old habits of assumption, but consistently over time with the growing commitment that comes from seeing slowly that a different way of being in the world is available to a person even at 70. He helped Edna move a load of firewood when his truck was going that direction anyway. He fixed a section of fence along their shared property line without being asked and without making a production of it. He sent Opal over with a jar of preserved plums in the fall of 1963, and Opal sat at the table and had coffee and stayed for 2 hours and came back the following month and the month after that. And whatever grew between Opal and Edna was not something either of them would have called a friendship immediately, but that was what it became. The letters from Cheyenne continued. Edna answered them at the table in the evenings in her careful handwriting, explaining what she had done and why it worked, and what the measurements needed to be for different building sizes. She went to Cheyenne once in the summer of 1963, riding in Cormac Delby's truck, because she did not entirely trust the fort on that distance anymore, and she sat in a government office with 3 engineers and a housing official, and she answered their questions for 4 hours. She brought Callum with her. He was 14 by then, and he sat in the corner of the conference room with his notebook and recorded the entire conversation. The engineers addressed their technical questions to Cormac at first with the reflexive assumption that the technical knowledge lived in the man who had produced the drawings, and Cormac redirected each question to Edna with the simple consistency of a person who understood where the knowledge actually lived, and by the second hour the engineers were directing their questions to the right person. On the drive home, Callum was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They kept asking Mr. Delby first." "Yes," Edna said, and then they stopped. "Yes." Callum wrote something in his notebook. Edna did not ask what it was. Some things are better left as the private record of the person keeping them. In the summer of 1966, a letter came from the county land office. It was in a plain envelope, the same kind the county used for everything, and Edna opened it with the equanimity of a woman who has opened many envelopes from many county offices and has learned that documents can be handled as calmly as any other piece of paper. Inside was the certificate of title to the land, 5 years of continuous residence fulfilled. The terms of the homestead agreement met. The land's 600 acres of Wyoming grass in one thin silver line of creek was hers. Free and clear, no conditions remaining, no further reviews required, no one who could take it. Edna sat at the table for a long time with the certificate in her hands. Then she got up and went to the shelf above her cot and took down the photograph of her son. She looked at his face, which was a face she knew so completely that she could see it clearly whether she was looking at the photograph or not. "Thomas," she said, "we did it." She stood there with the photograph for a while. Then she put it back on the shelf and took the certificate to the drawer beneath the table and placed it beside the notebook and the deed copy and the first letter from the housing office and all the other documents she had accumulated in 5 years of keeping careful records of things that mattered. She called the children. They were not small children anymore. Harriet was 20, living in town during the week and coming home on weekends, studying at the community college in a program that would eventually lead her to a career in building inspection, which surprised no one who had watched her read installation manuals at 14. Callum was 17, still keeping notebooks, still counting things, increasingly interested in the engineering behind what his grandmother had discovered by necessity. Blythe was 12, taller than expected, still humming, collecting stones entirely herself. They sat at the table together and Edna told them the land was theirs. Not just hers, theirs. Blythe put her head on the table and wrapped her arms around it, the way she had always expressed feelings too large for her body to hold in any other way. Callum wrote the date in his notebook. Harriet reached across the table and put her hand over Edna's hand and held it. "Dad would have liked this," she said. "He would have built something on it," Edna said. "Something bigger than we needed." "He always built bigger than necessary," Callum said. "He built for the future," Edna said. "That's not the same as unnecessary." They sat at the table for a while longer, not talking about anything in particular, the way families sit together when the thing that needed to be held together has held. In the spring of 1970, Harriet built the porch. She was 24 years old, and she had been planning it for 2 years, and she built it the way her grandmother had built everything, carefully with proper measurements. Without asking for help she didn't need, and without refusing help that was genuinely offered. It was a simple structure, a wooden platform extending 12 feet from the south door of the hut, covered with a roof supported by 4 posts, with 2 chairs and a small table, and a railing that Callum had cut and sanded himself. It was not the house. It was not the timber house that Daniel Whitfield had once talked about building, the house he had been saving toward before the tunnel collapsed. But it was real wood, and it was built by hands that had learned their work in the steel building behind it, and it faced south and caught the afternoon sun, and was in its modest way everything it needed to be. Edna sat in one of the chairs. On the afternoon Harriet declared the porch finished. The sun was low and warm. The valley spread out in front of her, the grass new green with spring, the creek running high and silver in the middle distance. The mountains were still white at their peaks. The sky was the particular Wyoming blue that she had never fully gotten used to, even after 9 years, the kind of blue that makes a person believe things. She sat in the chair, and she was still for a long time. "Thomas," she said quietly enough that no one inside could hear, "we have our porch." She sat there until the sun went down. One morning in the winter of 1971, Callum came outside to find Edna standing in the cold, not dressed for it, looking up at the roof of the hut. The 2 columns of smoke rose from the 2 chimneys as they had risen every cold morning for 10 years. Straight, steady, patient. 2 thin lines against a Wyoming sky that was the pale gray of early morning, climbing without hurrying into the air above the valley. Callum went back inside and came out with her coat and put it around her shoulders. She did not seem to notice, or she noticed and was grateful without saying so, which was the same thing at this stage of their life together. "I remember the first winter," he said. "You were 12. "I remember being warm," he said, "even when everyone else wasn't." She looked at the chimneys. "You stayed up every night," he said. "I saw you. You thought I was asleep, but I wasn't always asleep. You'd get up every 2 hours and put wood on the fire, and then sit at the table with the notebook." "Someone had to watch," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The smoke rose. Below them, the valley was beginning its slow morning brightening light, coming up behind the eastern ridge and spreading across the grass. "The 2 stoves saved us," he said. Edna shook her head, gently, not in disagreement with his feeling, but with the formulation of it. "No," she said, "we saved ourselves." He looked at the chimneys for a while longer, and then he looked at her, and she was watching the smoke the way she had watched things her whole life, directly, completely, with the full attention of someone who knows that what you see depends entirely on how honestly you are willing to look. She had come to Wyoming at 64 with nothing but 3 grandchildren and a pile of steel, and the refusal to accept that impossible was the same as impossible forever. She had spent a winter failing and studying the failure. She had climbed onto a steel roof in March in Wyoming and cut a second hole and put a second chimney through it while a powerful man stood below her and laughed. She had kept records. She had shared what she found. She had taken in the man who tried to take her land and nursed his wife back to health and shaken his hand afterward and meant what she said about starting over. She had stayed, not because it was easy, not because anyone around her made it easy, but because the 3 children inside the hut needed her too, and because the land was hers, and because she had learned in 64 years of living that the things worth having are the things you stay for when staying is the hardest thing available. The smoke rose, both columns, steady, even, unhurried. 2 small fires deep in the steel shell behind her, passing warmth back and forth between themselves in the slow, patient conversation they had been having for 10 years, doing what they had always done, what she had built them to do, keeping the cold from finding a place to settle, keeping the people inside alive and warm. Edna Whitfield pulled her coat tighter and watched the smoke a moment longer. Then she turned and went inside where the floor was warm, and the children, not children anymore, never children anymore, but hers, always hers, were beginning the sounds of a morning starting. She put the kettle on, she opened the notebook. She wrote the date and the temperature and the wood consumed overnight. She had not stopped writing it down. She would not stop. The record was the record, and the record mattered because the things you keep careful track of are the things that cannot be taken from you. And because someday, somewhere, someone standing at the edge of something impossible would need to know that another person had stood at the same edge and found a way through. Not a remarkable person, not a trained person, not a person with credentials or connections or resources beyond what the situation absolutely required. Just a person who paid attention. Just a person who wrote things down. Just a person who refused on a cold night in a steel house in Wyoming to believe that the heat was gone simply because she couldn't reach it yet. It was there. She had known it was there. She had looked until she found it, and when she found it, she had shared it, and the sharing had spread further than she had ever intended or imagined, warming people in places she would never see. That is what the smoke carried, not just heat. The proof that a person can outlast what everyone says will defeat them if they keep their eyes open, their notebook closed, and their fire burning through the night.